Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to go quite slowly with the introductions to allow you time to join and get your coffee and get settled. But thank you for joining us. Today's masterclass is a morning session, as you can see, and it's going to be all around the topic of the economy of the dark web, how data is traded. We were delighted when Crossword got in touch and said that they'd like to do this session with us. And we're equally as delighted to have Paul Watts hosting this session as well. So before I make a start with the introductions, I'll just do a quick reminder of our housekeeping rules. If you're a CIISec member and you've attended some of our events before, you'll be really familiar with this already. But for any people who are new joining us, welcome. This session is obviously brought to you by the Chartered Institute of Information Security, or CIISec. And this is how we normally do it. So we'll keep you on mute throughout this morning's webinar, but please do type your questions through to us. Say hello in the chat to us. Good morning. And we'll be picking those up kind of as and when, but the majority of them will probably come at the end. As I say, do type them through to us and we'll be picking those up. And if you do have any problems at all, which hopefully you don't, then do email us at support@ciisec.org if you can. And another member of my team will be able to help you out with any issues, hopefully. So that's just a quick reminder of the housekeeping rules. As I say, this session is all around the economy of the dark web, how data is traded. And today we're really lucky enough to have Paul Watts hosting this session, who is a distinguished analyst at the ISF. If any of you are on our ADP programme, you'll remember Paul did our last session in June, and he has a wealth of experience, over 25 years of experience in information technology. 17 of those years he has been a security executive and CISO in various different sectors, including financial services, retail, critical national infrastructure, food and beverage, and data analytics and market research. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's also a fellow of CIISec, to get us started and to introduce our speaker, John. Over to you, Paul.
Wow, thanks. And you've forgotten one small point, is that I have a sideline as well, where I have to help my mum clean up the viruses and malware that she picks up on a regular basis on her PC as well. Good morning, everybody. I know it's really, really early here in London. It's great to have you with us. Thank you and welcome to this CIISec Masterclass session. Sophie's done my introduction, so that's that box ticked. And today we are going to talk about data breaches and leaks, the economy of the dark web, and how data is traded. So let's start with a couple of opening questions. Would you know if your employees' and customers' data is being compromised? And if their usernames and passwords were being sold and shared by criminals on the dark web, would you know that? And what would you do if it happened to you? Joining me to pull all of this apart and make some sense of it all is John Innes, who's the product director at Crossword Cybersecurity. John, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Paul. Thank you for having me.
And let's see how many government ministers resign in the next 60 minutes as we unravel this topic.
Can we put a poll up?
Yeah, well, maybe we should, but let's rapidly move on. Let's start by getting to know a little bit about you, John. Tell us a bit about your background. How did you find yourself working in the threat intelligence space?
Well, so back in the early 2000s, I was working in a large government department, and I was just working in IT at the time, actually, and there was a big technical refresh going on. So they really wanted people to volunteer to become part of the security team in this big tech refresh, and literally nobody wanted to do it. There were people climbing over the kind of Active Directory components or the email. Everything else seemed super cool except for security. Literally nobody wanted to do it. And I was the only person in the whole organization that said, oh, I would really like to do that. I always had a bit of a fascination with kind of securities and vulnerabilities, and it was just something that appealed to me. So I kind of put my hand up and I joined the security team within the government, and we did lots of sort of interesting things around PKI and sandboxing and lots of interesting tools, and that really got me much more interested in the InfoSec space. So I started kind of learning my trade back in early 2000s, I suppose. And then after a few months, years in that kind of role, I was asked to get into like the big data side of things. So a bit like yourself, Paul, analytics and SIEM, log monitoring. And again, it sounded very, very boring. No one wants to look at logs, but actually I found it super fascinating. If you actually start getting into data, then all these sort of patterns and pictures start emerging that you never ever saw before. So I spent quite a lot of time working in that space, again, within the government. And then ultimately I enjoyed it so much that I kind of, I went off and joined a big US company that really specialized heavily in SIEM systems, SIM systems. And I was working for them for a number of years. And what we were seeing is that people were buying tools, but not really paying attention to the data. They were kind of hoping that the tool would do it all for them. So after we'd seen that on a repetitive pattern for a number of, every single time, actually, people were kind of buying the tool and turning it on and thinking it would be solved. And it wasn't. So we then actually set up a specialist company that we're going to focus much, much more on actually bringing the data alive. So, we knew that people were buying this technology, but what could we do to bring data alive? So I focused on, so we set up a company to do that. And we started, again, like yourself, working with the banks and various big industries and really starting to pull out these fascinating patterns. So again, rather than it just being seen as log data, chuck it all in a bucket and stick it in a vault, we could start finding real fraud through banking applications, for example, or real insider threat through patterns of behavior within the IT systems. So again, it really, the more you do this, the more it enthuses you around data. So I was kind of very, very fascinated and really enjoying like unpicking the secrets of data. So spent a few years doing that. That company eventually got acquired. And then I worked for a number of MSSPs and various other roles and stuff like that, always around the data and product. And then one day back in sort of 2015, I think it was, there was a data breach. And I recognized the name of the data breach, and it was a service that I knew that I used. And I'd never really looked into that sort of data particularly before, but I thought, actually, I'm going to go and see whether my data's in there. And when we sort of popped it open, I was just blown away by, like, not only could I see lots of things about myself in the data that I'd stored in this application, but they were there for everybody to see now. Again, credentials, passwords, secrets, but I could see everyone else's stuff as well. And there was no warning really to me about the impact of what that could mean. So that was really a bit of a eureka moment, that this is a really underserved issue that's kind of not really being talked about in the market. So we saw that issue and we decided that actually this is an underserved problem. There's something here that people need to know about and become aware of. So that was sort of, it started out on a love of security, and then it kind of moved into a love of data, and then it kind of evolved into a horror of data, I suppose. If when you look too far down the rabbit hole, it starts getting a little bit intimidating. So that's kind of how we decided that this was a really interesting space to be in, and we should probably put some effort into trying to help people.
So security geek come data nerd. I mean, that's a perfect combination. And, we could have a whole other conversation about the challenges of, data integrity, signal to noise, when you're looking at SIEM streams and intelligence feeds as well.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come on to that a little bit later on. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting journey that you've been on. I guess what we should do now really is start to talk about that. Let's talk about breaches and leaks. And on that subject, and I don't know if you saw this, but I couldn't help but notice a story that surfaced through the weekend, tail end at the start of this week, I think, regarding an online user under the name China Dan, who suggests that they are party to around 23 terabytes of data pertaining to 1 billion Chinese national residents. Now, to your point in terms of it's pretty sobering when you see yourself named in a breach, I think 1 billion Chinese people would probably feel quite unsettled to hear about this. What's your take on this? Is this a normal type of breach, or is this a bit out of the ordinary? Tell us a bit about this, John, if you wouldn't mind.
I haven't done a huge amount of analysis on it, Paul, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And I mean, obviously a billion Chinese people certainly aren't going to be happy. But as you know, the Chinese government are incredibly private people. So this will be nothing short of a disaster for them. They'll be fuming and embarrassed and everything else. It's the bits of the story that I have read. So it appears that one of the developers of the system has kind of been blogging about it. And this is not uncommon, actually. They've given away more information than they should have about the application, and there's talk of them leaking credentials as part of that kind of blog post. And it's there's a couple of interesting things about it. I think one is we definitely see this is definitely a route of attack for attackers now. So source code is for a non-developer like myself, source code is just source code. You just stare at it and kind of go, this looks like a jumble of words, but actually embedded in there are all kinds of secrets. So it's quite possible that someone's put a code snip up or something, and they've included an API key that they shouldn't have done, and it looked pretty harmless, but it's actually someone else has realized what it is, and they've punched a hole straight through it. So yeah, we do see unfortunately secrets leaked in source code quite a lot, and they're perfect examples of routes of access. And the other thing, I don't know if it's true, but I think the blog post, or the forum where this is being touted, this data breach is being touted at the moment, the individual offering it up is talking about, I can give you the entire blueprints for the Elastic cluster. And Elasticsearch is a very good, I'm not saying it was them at all, but if it was an Elastic cluster, a lot of the big breaches seem to come through misconfigured Elastic clusters as well, because I think people, they just want to put data in a big bucket, right? So they install a product, next, finished, fill it full of data, stick a front end on it, and then think it's done. And what they don't realize is that the cluster is completely unsecured. So it's quite easy to access, because again, developers and security people aren't always on the same page. Developers are trying to get the functionality out, security teams not necessarily involved. So it's not uncommon to see mistakes made like that, where API keys are leaked, and it's not uncommon to see insecure Elastic clusters or not tightly secured Elastic clusters. So unfortunately, it's sensational because of its size. As you say, 24 terabytes, I think it was, and 1 billion people have been affected. So it's definitely one that's making the news right now, but the MO is not radically uncommon.
Yeah, I mean, it's one in a long line of examples where, poor configuration, poor secure by design principles, and generally lackluster hygiene have opened the door to threat actors to getting in. And it's a whole other conversation in terms of the collective responsibility for security, and developers have to play their part just as much as everybody else does. But let's not pick on developers because I'm sure they'll come after me, and I don't want that at all. So you say that this is quite sensational in terms of volume of data. Just elaborate a little bit about what you're seeing in general terms. What sort of volumes do we generally see in a typical data breach? Who's behind this? Are we talking about organized gangs, nation states, lone wolves? What's the kind of general? What's a typical breach look like these days, John?
Well, when we first started looking at these data breaches, it was a big deal to us, but it wasn't a big deal to everybody else. So we would see a data breach every few weeks, maybe every 6 weeks, 8 weeks, there would be something that hit the news. Again, we've heard about Yahoo and LinkedIn in the past. So every now and again, there would be a big data breach. And it was usually lone wolves or someone, that typically done it. Then certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, the kind of the leak potential, I guess, if you want to call it that, has gone absolutely through the roof. So it used to be, again, you would normally see a large amount of data breaches attributable to a lone wolf again. So somebody figured out a technique, and they were very, very keen on exploiting that technique, and they would start dropping data on a regular basis. So a few years ago, there was someone going by the moniker of Gnostic Players, and they started hitting the news because they were dropping dozens and dozens of leaks. So they found their way. They found some strategy that they could kind of use to extract this data. And then they sort of dropped off the scene, and then almost immediately a new group turned up, or a new individual called Shiny Hunters, who had a very similar kind of style in lots of ways. Whether or not it's the same person is speculation, but there were individuals who had really good techniques, and they were dropping a lot of data breaches and causing an absolute, chaos. There was thousands of people having a go, like hobbyists, but we used to be able to see it was a case of a lone wolf, or probably a nation state. It was kind of one of those things, right? That were doing the majority, but it was a lot of that data was sort of being leaked as well. For sport, people were proud of themselves. I've managed to hijack this data, and I've managed to kind of leak it, and I want the kudos for doing that. But again, over the last few years, what we've seen is all of the pieces of the puzzle coming together that make it commercially a highly successful enterprise. So cryptocurrencies come on the scene, which is very easy to obtain, launder, spend, transfer, and of course the blockchain traces all that, but they're building tools to try and distribute that money and make that very, very clear. Ransomware has become very effective. So we're also seeing all of the motivations are really coming together to turn this from like a bit of a hobby into a full-blown enterprise, as we see. And so it's changing radically. And I think over the last few years, we've seen a massive explosion. Like, people really realize that crime does pay if they kind of put effort into it. So we're seeing much more effort. We're seeing the groups spread. So we're seeing much more effort from individuals and crime groups going into it. And they're getting much more resourceful about how they're exploiting the attacks and things like that as well. So yeah, it used to be, if you were going to rob a bank, you'd either have to be incredibly stupid or incredibly brave, right? Because everyone's going to come after you. Like if you go and rob a bank in a high street, then everyone's talking about it and everyone's looking for you. Yeah. When everybody's robbing banks, then it suddenly becomes far less risky, right? Because you're diluted in terms of your ability to get caught. And over the last few years, as it's ramped up, we're seeing it's gone from a few brave or stupid individuals carrying out crime to a bit of an open season, really. Now, more and more people are just getting into it, not just because it's financially worthwhile, but because they're diluting. Like they are becoming part of a massive population of attackers. So I think it's the problem is just growing, and every time there's a data breach, they're sharing that data, and that's giving them more material to kind of go at somebody else again. So it's it's getting pretty horrific.
I think we've reached that inflection point, really, haven't we, where the penny's finally dropped. This old cliche that people like Peter Sumner were talking about way back in the 80s, that data would be the new oil. And we've kind of sleptwalked into a situation where we weren't adequately protecting that commodity. Yeah. And criminals are seizing the opportunity to exploit that, building on, like we said earlier, really poor basic security hygiene, and just that speed of technology innovation and the speed in which organizations adopt it. It almost creates a perfect storm. I mean, I think about the good old days, when I used to walk around an office with a copy of Dr. Solomon's antivirus updates on a 3.5-inch disc. I wonder if people will remember that. Where, virus authors, people like the authors of Cascade, 1704, they wanted people to see their work. They were like graffiti artists. Now it's all very clandestine and in the shadows, and with the exception of script kiddies that make a lot of noise, and it's easy to spot those signals by and large. It's not easy to spot advanced persistent threat. It's not easy to spot these people trying to come in, and I guess that's what makes threat intelligence so important in the modern detect, protect, respond capabilities of modern business, right?
Well, you're 100% right, Paul. And again, like, as you say, people used to do it for fascination. Like, it used to be, honestly, people just wanted the kudos or whatever it was. Yeah. Now they are literally making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars out of this enterprise. And I think they're moving all the time, right? So they're doing exactly what we are doing, right? So we're constantly monitoring the threat, coming up with the defense. They're constantly monitoring the defense, coming up with a new threat model. And again, we've seen with the way that data is being leaked and monetized as well. Now, it used to be, you can have it for free because I want to be famous. And then it's like anyone can buy it for 1,000 Bitcoin, $1,000 or whatever, and you can have it. And then we moved on to ransomware, right? Which is I'm going to steal all your data and encrypt it. In fact, that stealing came later. So to start with, it was just, I'm going to encrypt it. And unless you pay me a ransom, I'm going to get it back. And then people stopped paying the ransom. And then they're like, I'm going to encrypt it, and I'm going to publish it and let people know that I've published it if you don't pay the ransom. So I'm going to start embarrassing you. But they were publishing it on the dark web. So again, businesses are like, okay, we've figured this out. We now know that we need to back up because we weren't doing that before. So actually, if we get ransomware, we can restore. So then the attackers go and put it all online on the dark web, and they go, look, we're going to embarrass you and tell people that we've leaked your data. That didn't work so well because it was on the dark web. So even if a company had its data stolen and it was leaked, they probably didn't need to worry too much about it because they've done the restore, and of course it's a disaster and going to tell the ICO or whatever, but it's hidden. So then they stopped putting it on the dark web, the attackers, and now they're going, we're going to put it on Google effectively, and we're going to let everybody know now that the whole world can see that you've leaked this data. And again, still a nightmare. And now they're starting to put search bars in it. They're literally indexing the data and kind of going, well, your customers can just come online and look themselves up. So they're always upping the ante, trying to increase the pressure on business the entire time. And I had a really interesting conversation with someone the other day. If you or I started a business, Paul, and we got £10 million worth of investment, right? We would have all of this oversight and this governance, and are you using the money correctly? Is the business doing well? You'd have a board, right, examining what you're doing. Attackers are now getting millions and millions of dollars, and they're not just buying Lambos with it, they are reinvesting, right? They're improving their infrastructure, they're hiring more coders, they're looking for new exploits. And we are literally, unfortunately, funding an industry that's out there to harm us. And that's really where this is all going at the moment, unfortunately.
And just building on that, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat window and trying to keep an eye on the time as well, because the hour's going to run away with us. The question that Ross Burns actually raised here, just to build on that, are you seeing increased involvement of nation states undertaking data breaches for commercial and for political purposes? And somebody mentioned the Lazarus Group in North Korea is a classic example of that. But are we seeing a trend? Is there an uptick in nation state activity, or is it kind of ticking over in the background and you've got the criminalization running alongside that, the freelancers? What's happening there?
Well, again, the situation in Ukraine has like created such a mess, because like I say, we were seeing like this uptick. Like nation state would always be very, very quiet, right? So obviously the last thing they really want to do is get caught, but you would get nation states like North Korea perhaps like using it for political or financial gain. Now, literally, the gloves are off because there was so much noise, and nobody is really worried about getting caught anymore. So I think we're seeing a lot of like nation state activity happening in the guise of private enterprise. So actually, there are groups, either literally nation state groups carrying out attacks because they want access to material that is not available to them through traditional means, or they're going to go and pay criminals on the streets to purport it for them. And again, like where we used to see breaches against, I'll just pick on LinkedIn because it happened and it's a famous one, where we used to see breaches against LinkedIn. Now we're seeing like dumps of like entire like water utility systems and things like that, including blueprints and SCADA control systems and stuff. So probably the answer to that is yes. I think we are seeing nation states enjoying the chaos that is unfolding on the internet, frankly. Yeah.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to jump a little bit forward. It'll be interesting to talk about some of the tools, techniques, and processes, procedures that are followed. But let's talk a little bit about the dark web. So let's put in nation states to one side, because I think their crime economy works slightly differently. But Tell us a little bit about the dark web. Tell us a little bit about the dark web economy, and give us a bit of insight into how it works and how these data thefts are monetized for commercial gain or simple collection of funds by crime syndicates.
Yeah, sure. So, and you'll know this perfectly well, Paul. So for the people on the call who aren't aware, the dark web is a part of the internet that you can't easily get to, right? So you have to kind of download specific software, and the idea is that when you go through this specific web browser, it bounces you around a few servers, and then you pop out the other side in order to get your data. And bad people like using it because it provides anonymity. I can never say that word. I can say it 50 times.
Especially on a Wednesday morning.
No, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So it provides a perfect hiding place, basically, where somebody can host data, somebody can kind of get data, and they can kind of bounce around and get through it. But it's not ideal, actually. It's perfect if you're selling drugs or guns, because they are clearly like huge crimes that you will spend a lot of time, and other crimes you will spend a lot of time in prison for. But with this sort of data, it doesn't lend itself so well to the dark web for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of the dark web is very unstable, actually. So a lot of the websites on the dark web don't exist for very long, and a lot of these guys rely on quick dissemination of the data. So they actually want it found, they want it for sale, and they want to be able to monetize it very, very quickly. And the dark, because servers go up and down on the dark websites, get shut down all the time because it's probably a PC running under someone's desk or something actually on the back end. That's one problem. And the dark web is incredibly slow as well, because you're hopping through servers. If you actually try and do anything on it, it's not great. So this example of this 24 terabytes that have just been stolen from China, the media reports about things being on the dark web, but most of it actually isn't. It's on what we would call the deep web. So these are actually just forums, Google accessible really, but you probably need some sort of membership or an invite to get into them. You need some kind of reputation. But again, I think this is a reflection on the brazenness of the whole thing now. We're seeing like huge websites popping up that are relatively easy to access, huge membership numbers, vast amounts of data with very little protection. But actually they can just spin the server up in Russia or somewhere like that they know that it's very easy to do that, and they're not going to get caught. So actually they're moving it off of the dark web onto the deep web, and even onto the open web sometimes, and they're just putting in certain controls and protections around the data, depending on how valuable it is. But in terms of actually the price, I mean, it varies massively based on kind of what you're dealing with. So we see people give it away because, again, they want the kudos. If someone's actually managed to get hold of like a pair of admin credentials, for example, to be able to access a bank through an RDP server, then that might go for $5,000 or something. So this isn't big money, and we saw a breach a couple of years ago where somebody bought a username and password for an RDP server for a huge company that everyone on the call would know, and they paid $10 for it. Because from the seller's perspective, they figured out that it worked, so they just put it up for sale. I've got this username and password for an RDP server. It's $10. And then somebody bought that for $10. There's a British guy, actually, he's now in prison. But he broke into the servers of this very big infrastructure, this very big company, stole tons of emails, files, and then was trying to blackmail them effectively. So the cost to entry for crime can be absolutely trivial. If it's a little bit more interesting, if we've got access to the backbone of a telco or something like that, that might creep into the tens of thousands of dollars. And like we've seen this week with this data for $200,000 for the Chinese data, that's really just based on volume. It's quite expensive actually. $200,000 for stolen data is actually quite a pretty penny, but it is 1 billion people. So and invariably what will happen now is somebody will buy that for $200,000. They probably won't pay $200,000 for it. They'll negotiate it down to $70,000 or something, and then they'll buy that, and then they'll resell it on, right? So they'll sell it to 3 people for $50,000 each, So then they'll have the data and they'll get all their money back. And then those 3 people will do the same thing again. So even these huge caches, that the stuff from China will probably turn up in 2 months for free, I imagine. So it's very, very easy for data to get stolen, for lots of people to make a lot of money out of it, and then it becomes very widely available for criminals to start acting against it.
I mean, we've moved on, right? I mean, I remember the early days of this where it was, the carders were there and you could buy drugs and so forth, and everybody will remember the story of the Silk Road. And we've moved into incredibly more nefarious and probably easier to trade world of data and credentials and so on and so forth. I mean, the CIISec did some research last year, actually, a report called Threat Horizon, and what struck us with the way that the ransomware industry has evolved. Yeah. Is you now have a fragmented kind of niche area called initial access brokers, and they're marketing this data to either ransomware gangs or freelancers to get the legwork of getting initial access so they can do their implantation and crack on from there. There's a myriad of different reasons why people get at this data. Have you seen any examples of that where data has been traded on the dark web to gain initial access, like credential access, for example, but then that's been used as a pivot to a much bigger attack? Have we seen kind of evidence of that kind of staged attack, which starts with the purchase of stolen credentials on the dark or deep web?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of lots of times, and you're exactly right about the initial access brokers. There are people, I think they call them affiliates as well or something. Mm-hmm. They've got all these terminology. It really is a very well-oiled machine that they've got going on. I mean, quite often they fall out over money and stuff, which is always entertaining. And then they end up what we call doxing each other. So for people on the call, doxing is like trying to reveal about as much about a person as you possibly can. So that's usually these crime groups fall apart at some point over money, and it will go, like Black Hat Willie was actually Paul Watts, and here's his home address and all of his. Sorry, it was the first thing that popped into my head, but so that's sort of super interesting. But they are very well-oiled machines. So you're right. Someone will be paid exclusively to get into the network, and then once they're in, then they kind of give that back to the malware teams, and then the malware teams will deploy, and then maybe someone else will get paid for the financial kind of negotiations and things like that. But we've seen we've seen lots of credentials sold for money, which has been then executed. Again, the one that I was talking about earlier was a big insurance firm. There was access sold very, very cheaply, and then somebody else, because I think selling access doesn't feel so bad to criminals, right? I'm just selling access, like I didn't do anything. But then you kind of get the really aggressive people that take that forward and then try and destroy the network or do the heist because they've got zero moral compass whatsoever. But for example, the Colonial Pipeline was big news. Well, it's probably a year ago now, I think, was it, or something like that?
Yeah, getting that way. Yeah.
And I'm sure, again, people on the call have probably heard about this, but this huge oil pipeline that runs across America, delivers, I think, 10% of the US's energy. And they got compromised, and they got ransomware, and the entire pipeline got shut down, and it devastated like the energy sector it shut them down for weeks, and I think the consequences are still being felt right now. There were forensic analysis done on that compromise afterwards, because again, it was a massive deal. And I think it was Mandiant did the post-mortem on the breach, and when they actually did the post-mortem, they didn't directly attributed it, but they sort of said, look, we could see a point of access was a VPN, and the credentials used on that VPN were clearly available on the dark web. So, they had been found somewhere else, again, in another data breach or something like that. And that was used, so somebody stole it from somewhere, put it on the dark web, somebody else took that credential and then used it possibly to gain access to the Colonial Pipeline, and then shut the entire thing down. And I can't remember what the ransom was, $10 million or something like that. So yeah, unfortunately, there is again, you're right, there is a distributed network of what part people are comfortable playing. So some people really, really enjoy the data harvesting, the poking at the front door, but that's as far as they're kind of comfortable going. They're like, I'm not a bad person, I'm just curious, but here's my data. And there's someone else who kind of can't be bothered with that legwork. They just want to make money. Will take that foothold and then go and absolutely take over the network.
I mean, I'm blown away how this has turned into such a commercial, enterprise, and the fragmentation that we're seeing now, which makes it, considerably more difficult to track and trace. And that's the challenge that we have. You're not dealing with one threat actor with a particular MO that you can trace now. You're talking about multiple threat actors that actually build a bit of an attack chain, and you might be able to break that chain in particular pieces, but they're coming at us from all directions now. And it's funny you mentioned some of these crime gangs falling out over money. They fall out over politics as well. So some will recall what happened with the Conti group and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and Conti comprised of people from all over the planet, Russians and Ukrainians, and they kind of took exception there, and we know what happened following that. I think we should probably talk a little bit about how this data comes to be on the dark web in the first place. I'm a huge advocate of prevention is better than cure, although everybody on the call will recognise the need to balance, protect, detect, and respond controls anymore. It's not a question of if you're going to get compromised. It's a question probably of when. So how is this happening? Ben raises an interesting question on the Q&A, which is, how much does insider threat play a part in access being sold to systems? How do these threat actors get access to people on the inside, for example, and say, look, for a commission, get us access to this data, and we'll do the rest, and you'll make a tidy sum out of that. So is there a little bit of that going on, as well as the lapses in hygiene, the lack of multi-factor authentication? Give us a bit of a précis of that, if you will, John.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are multiple routes in, right? And like we talked about before, they're very strategic, and they're always looking for if there's an obstacle in their way, they're going to get around it. That's their MO, exactly like it's our way to put obstacles in their way. So, the phishing is definitely still a thing. So again, what we saw on again, I'm just interested in data. So I saw a data breach a little while ago, which is quite interesting, and it was a data breach on a company that, let's just say, you could scan stuff and send it like PDFs, and you can kind of like OCR a document and send it. Mm-hmm. And there was a data breach on that company, and the notice from them were, we're really sorry, we've had a data breach. And by the way, I don't judge anyone for having a data breach. It could happen to literally any one of us. We can only do the best that we can do. So I don't think there's anything to gain from ever shaming anybody. But there was a PDF company that could scan documents. You could scan documents and then send them to people. And they got compromised, and so their response was, we're really sorry, we've reset all your passwords, some data was lost, but we're doing our best to recover it. And most people, again, because you're not looking at the data, you're not really thinking about what actually got lost. And what we saw was, like, there was one table, and it had usernames and passwords and encrypted perhaps, but it had a funny reference in it. So Paul Watts, hashed password, some other metadata, and some weird reference. But then when we were looking at the data more, there was another table somewhere else, and it had these reference numbers in it, which like linked directly to PDF file names and like where they'd been sent to and things like that. So again, actually, with a modicum of effort, an attacker could have joined those tables together and said, oh, Paul is sending these PDF documents with these titles in it to these people, which from a sort of a targeted like spear phishing attack, it's priceless, right? I know it's you, and I know that you send PDF documents to do with accounts or HR or something or other else, and I know who you send it to. So I'm gonna, that becomes super easy for somebody to kind of click a link and then get compromised. So that's definitely still like flavor of the month, I would say. You really can't appreciate how much stuff is being leaked, and it's nobody's fault, but it's pouring fuel on the fire the entire time. Every time there's a data breach, there's kind of multiple things happen. We go, oh, sorry to hear about that, I hope you're okay. what did you lose? And at the same time, the attackers are feeding off of it and like having a frenzy. So that's definitely the kind of 70-80% like MO at the moment. So I think that's where, that's where I focus my time. And I think, for people trying to catch low-hanging fruit, that's where you probably should spend your time. But there is definitely for the prize winners, there is an insider threat. There is a bit of an insider threat theme growing as well. And it's always disappointing to hear that. But I think if you have staff who are in a privileged position holding access to privileged systems who are, for whatever reason, suffering, like financial problems or marital problems or things like that, then there is a risk there as well. So, and I think this kind of plays into this whole zero trust like model that everybody's moving to, right? Only give people access to what they need and protect every element of the network, because inside I don't think it's a massive problem. I think most people are good people, but the more we're all going to third-party suppliers, right? Supply chain is a big issue. Those suppliers are very often outsourcing their operations again. So we don't really know ultimately who's got access to our data. So it's a problem, but I don't think if you're a company with people, I haven't seen any evidence really, particularly that's a growing problem. Like, for example, has the ISF got an insider problem? I very, very much doubt it. If you are dependent on lots of external suppliers, there's a much more increased chance that there is going to be an insider problem at some point in that chain.
I mean, it comes back to the basic principle of crime, which is means, motive, and opportunity. So when you're looking at your defence in depth, it's thinking about how you control, manage, and/or neutralise any one of those three things put together. Then you have a problem. And you touched on zero trust, and somebody will chuck a virtual brick at me if I go down this particular rabbit hole. So I won't do. But I think it's an interesting point in that historically, we've taken a defence in-depth approach, but once you're inside the network, for the most part, organisations have not done a great job of segmentation. So lateral movement and reconnaissance is actually very, very easy. Do you think that the zero trust approach, which is trust no transaction at all at any time, is probably a way forward? But do you also agree that that needs to be complemented by a careful and more stringent management of the human factor? It's everybody's responsibility, right? What are your views on that?
Yeah. I think both. I think actually there is just no edge anymore. There really isn't. We're all using Google, Microsoft, Dropbox, Xero, Sage. Like there is no edge. Everything is connected to everything else. We've got no visibility. So, and unfortunately, every time we think that we've got secure network, someone punches a hole in it. So, like I think the zero trust element is absolutely it's a thing, and it needs to be taken seriously. Do I think the user element is equally important? 100%. I think it's more important. If we again, like battering people over the head for clicking a link is no solution in my view. But I really do think that we've all got a huge responsibility now to make our users aware of what they're doing and what the consequences of what they're doing are. But I also think I'm going to embarrass myself now. I think it really has to be practical security, and I'll tell you what I mean, and this is why I'm embarrassed, and I don't know why I'm about to even say this, but I was on site for a little while at a company some time ago, which will stay nameless, but I was kind of a guest on the network, so they were right. Like, we want you to come and do some analysis and things like that, and so I was there. It was an unfamiliar environment to me, right? And as soon as I joined, like they're like, click this link to access your HR system, and it went off to some spurious internet address, right? And I clicked it, and it was really the HR system. And then it was like, click this link to do this other thing, and it was some other spurious internet address, and I was like, clicked it, and it was a real application that the business was using, and this went on for like my entire time that I was there. And one day I got this thing going, you need to click this thing to do this thing. And I clicked it, and it was like, it was a phishing attack, and you should never click links. And I was embarrassed because I clicked it, but then I was like, what are we, what good is that, right? You've literally just programmed me to click 50 links and then kind of, publicly humiliated me for, I mean, it wasn't public humiliation, it was a training exercise, but I was like, clicking a link's not a bad thing. If I'd have hit a fake Office 365 page and typed in some credentials, I think at that point, that was probably fairer. But I think, we have to be really, really practical about what we're talking to users about in terms of what's realistic.
I completely agree, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation, and you can't keep bashing people over the head with phishing tests. And to your point, I mean, I give this advice, and everybody else is going to go, we already know this, Paul. I'm going to say it anyway. If you can use multi-factor authentication, please turn it on. Users do click on phishing links. Users do populate, spurious forms with their own credentials. MFA, it's a relatively simple thing to turn on in this day and age. But look, I will leave it there. John, I wanted to talk a little bit about the other side of the fence. So, there's a million and one pieces of advice we give everybody on a regular basis in terms of how to keep your house in order. But just coming back to the original question I asked, which is, would you know if your employee and customers' data is being compromised? Talk to me a little bit about how you can monitor the dark web. What tools exist to monitor and mitigate risk? And before I do that, I will just say this as an honest disclaimer for anybody out there. The dark web and the deep web is not a place to go venturing if you don't know what you're doing. Please don't do it using your corporate networks, your corporate infrastructure, because you will, and you will deserve a good clattering around the head if you're caught. But with that in mind, John, what services, tools and capabilities can organisations draw down for threat intelligence? Is that something you grow in-house? Is that something you buy as a service? What are your thoughts on all of that, please?
So there are, I really, again, I come from a SIM background, and I've always been of the camp that you can't defend what you can't see, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're not looking, you're never going to be able to put up defenses. Again, we've been monitoring data leaks a long, long time. It's like a morbid fascination, if you will. But we've seen this data growing and growing and growing. And genuinely, all it's doing, every time there's a data breach, there's a victim, which is the company that got hacked. There are sub-victims, if you will, which are people like you and me whose data are in it. And then there are beneficiaries, and they're the people that are selling the data. And then there are the people that are going to go and use that data to execute new crimes. So there's two sides to every coin on that kind of thing. We're now seeing so much data leaking that it's now hitting other people's radar. So this is not a regulation, but the Financial Conduct Authority recently, a little while ago, put out an industry insights paper. So this isn't a regulatory policy, it's advice from the FCA. And one of the things in there is we recommend that you monitor for data leaks and data dumps, credentials leaking, because it's a thing, right? And actually, it's great putting up defenses, but if someone's got your working credentials, they're going to find a way in. You might have MFA on the front door, but then they're just going to go and use some cloud service like GitHub. We see attacks on that all the time because people can log into the ISF's GitHub, for example, using username and password, and then go and steal API keys to go and get into something else. So we see these kind of things happening all the time. We're now starting to see the FBI and regulators sort of saying you need to pay attention to this data because it's going to hurt you if you don't. So we do encourage people to start monitoring for this, because this is the next wave of pain, or another wave of pain that's coming. But you're 100% right, Paul. I mean, no, I'm not going to say it. I was going to say you could go and get it, but just don't go and get it. But there is a lot of out there. Most of it, again, it's in unsavory places. Most of it has been probably primed with malware. So you can have it, but the minute you open it, it's going to detonate on your PC and lock up your network and things. So, and also the data is a complete mess. When we find it, it can be in all sorts of different formats. It's been mangled around. So it's a huge amount of work to try and clean it up. So I would encourage people to monitor for this stuff because it is dangerous and it could really hurt you. We have a shameless plug now, but we've spent years building a piece of software called Trillion, which is a crossword product. And we have on our website, the if you go to www.threatstatus.com, there's a little search bar in there, and you can put in your company email address, and that will basically run what we call we call it quick check internally, but it's like a triage, and it'll try and triage and see whether or not we can see things like that. So there's that out there. There's little free services if you want to check your home email. I'm sure everybody on the call has heard of Have I Been Pwned? I think if you want to kind of get a superficial look at your own personal emails, that's a nice little service. If you want something for your company, then there are corporate tools out there that will do exactly the same sort of thing on a much more enterprise scale. But I'm not saying it for any other reason than I've seen what's in the data. Like, people should definitely start monitoring for this stuff.
And what prerequisites are there? So I'm interested in this as well. So for those who have an interest in ISO 27000, you'll note that the latest update to 27002 talks about threat intelligence as a control. Now, that will in time find its way to Annex A on 27001. And organisations, my fear is that organisations will scramble to find these threat intelligence capabilities. But I'm an advocate of only absorbing data that I have the capacity to process. You know, there's nothing worse than a situation where you're gathering lots and lots of information and insight you can do nothing with. Then a compromise happens, and it then comes to pass that the information that would have allowed you to have defeated that incident was under your nose the whole time. So when is an organisation ready for this, John?
So there are different ways of getting this data. So if we just talk about credentials for a minute, because it's such a wide scale of threat intelligence, but there are different ways of getting the data. Again, don't do it, but you could go and just fetch it yourself. And you know, if you've got sandboxes and you know how to kind of keep yourself safe, you could hire a couple of people and go do that yourself. But again, like the colonial pipeline, like the credentials were there, nobody was looking, it compromised the entire network. But at the same time, if you go and download 7 billion rows of data, like, how often are you going to do that? You know, you'll probably do it once, and then even if you had the time to get the data and look through the data, then once you've done it, you're going to call that a done deal, right? Are you going to go and do that again tomorrow and again the next day? So it's quite a if you don't tool up, it's a very, very kind of expensive process in terms of people. Our approach to it has always been actually like everything that can possibly be removed from the process because it's unnecessary, let's do that. So for example, like if we find data for someone and it doesn't have a password in it, we should tell you, but let's not panic you, right? Because there are services out there. Again, Have I Been Pwned is a brilliant service for free users and home users, but it's unable to tell you whether or not your password was in a leak. It might well say, Paul, you were in this leak, and there were passwords in it, but it can't tell you whether or not your password is in it. So that leaves you scrambling, right? And you suddenly go, do I need to reset it? What was it? So I think, you know, it's important to get accurate data. So again, I'm going to talk about our service for a moment because we spent a lot of time doing this. So it's really important to be able to get accurate data that is actionable, which is the key, right? So if I find data for you and I'm reporting on data about you, I need to be very succinct about, this is Paul, he still works at the ISF, so therefore he's relevant. So we kind of need to deal with that point. The data is dangerous because we've done this analysis on it and there's clear text passwords, and we see those passwords being reused all over the internet. So we want to talk about that. That's another priority for us. We now need to we want to loop Paul into the process because he's the only one who's going to really know whether this password is dangerous to the ISF. Maybe not on AD, but maybe on some Dropbox thing that he's using for the ISF or something like that. So you need to factor in all these things. So that was a really long answer to your question, but so from a Trillium perspective, we've got companies using it from like 10 users up to governments. So it's ready to kind of go immediately. There are services out there where you can kind of try and obtain raw material, but then again, you're left doing all of the work and you kind of need to do it every single day to kind of stay relevant and on top of it. So so I you know, for certain levels of threat intel, like credentials, I think companies at any size are ready to go. Do you want to consume information about the next Russian APT hacking group and Fuzzy Bear and all this stuff. Is that useful to you? Most companies not. Banks and things like that, sure, they'll want to stay on top of that, but most mid-sized companies probably far less so.
That makes perfect sense. And yeah, start small, dream big. Absolutely agree with that. And again, just the most basic piece of advice. If you do have open phone, for example, and you see your credentials on there, certainly consumers, the advice I always say is, if you're using the same password across multiple systems, you're probably in a bit of danger right now. Remedy that by using, discrete passwords, use multi-factor authentication. I get sick of saying the same thing over and over again. I won't lie, but it's basic fundamental stuff that can mitigate to an extent, but it's not going to stop a determined threat actor, a nation state actor. I'm conscious that we're running out of time. I'm just going to kind of summarize, John, and then I wouldn't mind if there's something else that we think we need to tell the audience, and that would be great, just in terms of advice, it's something they can take away. We talked about the importance of education. Talk to your business, talk to your staff, get everybody involved. That's way beyond threat intelligence, but it's really, really key. The dangers of oversharing on social media, if that was indeed the vector for this breach over in China, but I see it all the time. Misconfigured S3 buckets, that sort of stuff. Basic hygiene. Everybody is responsible for that. Management of your API keys. Keep all that close to yourself. Use of multi-factor authentication and varying credentials across multiple services. That's the basic stuff. If you are going to monitor the dark web, be ready to do it. Recognize the perils of doing it yourself and the complexities of doing it yourself. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Too much knowledge that you cannot handle is equally a dangerous thing, certainly for CISOs. Make sure that the data that you do collect is actionable, that you have the capacity to do something with it, that it has context. So if you don't understand and don't have a good enumeration of your enterprise, you don't know what systems you have, you don't know what your perimeter looks like, you don't know what services you're using outside your own internal perimeter, it's going to be very, very hard to contextualize and do something useful with any threat intelligence. And I guess the other thing is try and keep all of this interesting. One of the things that I worry about is, the media are very, very good at sensationalizing some of these stories. And I worry that in time, there'll be a little bit of apathy, that data breaches are just a part of everyday life. And I don't think it needs to be that way, personally. I think they're the main things, just in terms of summing up, John. Is there anything else that you'd want to add to that?
No, I think you summed it up perfectly, Paul. I think MFA is, super important. The one thing that we do come across, or I would add to that, is like when you implement MFA, open your mind a little bit, because MFA on Google alone doesn't mean that you've got MFA, right? Lots of companies use lots of services, and just to reiterate, we saw about a year ago, we saw dozens and dozens of companies get hacked, and some of them had really good security and they had MFA. And it was still down to credential pairs. But what people were doing was they were logging into, again, supply chain, right? So rather than attack the ISF, they attacked GitHub using ISF credentials, for example. And by the way, it wasn't ISF. It's because it's right above your head. Yeah, it's right above your head. So it's just, but instead of going for the ISF, they would go for GitHub, because they didn't have 2FA on GitHub. So Paul at our isf.com with a password of pencil wouldn't work against ISF, but it would work against GitHub. And once they're in GitHub, they can go and steal other secrets like API keys, which would let them back into the infrastructure. So when you talk about 2FA, or when we talk about 2FA, open your mind. There are other systems that the IT teams aren't aware of that the business will be using, developers, finance teams. So I think, just be aware of the scope of that is one thing. And the other one that I just think is overlooked somewhat, and this feels really patronizing to even say it, but back up, because I think we're all using the cloud now. We use Google or we use Office or something like that. And because it's in the cloud, it feels like it's not our problem anymore. Or I'm pretty sure if I had a problem, I'd just log back into Google and it'll all be there. That's not necessarily true, right? If it gets encrypted in G Drive, when you log back in, it's still encrypted in G Drive. So it's not backed up by default necessarily. So you kind of got to keep an eye on that as well, and make sure that you've got a good belief that you can recover that stuff. So I think you said both of those things already, Paul, but I just wanted to kind of kind of expand on them slightly. But
no, that's perfect. Thank you, John. I think it's, you know, you get the basics right and build on that is really important. And I've taken a note to change my my password of pencil to crayon. So thank you for pointing that out to me.
You're welcome. The classic.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I hope that the audience has taken some ideas away from this. How can they reach you if they'd like to follow up with you, John?
So they can either, again, if you want to run a scan on your own website, for example, so we're you can, well, I won't say it, but if you go to www.threatstatus.com, you can just put your email in there and that will run almost an instant scan. So it will kind of go and do a triage for you, and it will pull back things that Trillian thinks it can see. We don't deal in smoke and mirrors. It's all fact-based information that gets returned. So if someone wanted to kind of do a little hygiene check, they could do it that way. Or if they want to contact me directly, they could email me at jon.iwns@crosswordcybersecurity.com.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. We're at the top of the hour now, so we'll call it there. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you all again at a future CIISec Masterclass session. Have a great day and see you all very soon. Thank you and goodbye. Cheers.
Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.